In previous video, we have discussed about image forming mechanisms of eye and various defects associated with it. Today we will discuss about visual pathway. But before starting visual pathway, let's very briefly review what we have discussed in visual system till now. So we have discussed that eye uses powerful optical principles to accurately focus an image on retina. Once the image is focused on retina, these photosignals, they are converted into electrical signals by photoreceptors of retina by means of phototransduction cascade. Then retina does low-level visual processing, and then selected and more refined information is transmitted to the brain via the visual pathway for intermediate and high-level processing. Now let's discuss about visual field. So what is visual field? It is the area of external environment which can be seen by one eye or both eyes when the eyes are fixated in one direction. So the area of external environment which can be seen by one eye is called monocular visual field, and if seen by both eyes, it is called binocular visual field. Visual field of the human eye has an angle of 160 degrees in horizontal meridian and 135 degrees in vertical meridian. Now visual field, it is divided into four parts: temporal field, nasal field, upper field and lower field, as shown in the image here. Visual field of each eye is divided into two unequal parts by a vertical line passing through the fixation point. These are outer or temporal field and the inner or nasal field, as seen in the image here. Temporal part of visual field extends up to about 100 degrees, but the nasal part extends only up to 60 degrees because it is restricted by nose. Visual field of each eye is also divided into an upper field and a lower field by a horizontal line passing through the fixation point. Now extent of upper field is about 60 degrees as it is restricted by upper eyelid and orbital margin, whereas the lower field, it extends to about 75 degrees as it is restricted by cheek. Thus the visual field is restricted in all the sides except in the temporal part. Now let's come to the concept of corresponding retinal points. So what are corresponding retinal points? Corresponding retinal points are the areas in retina of both eyes on which the light rays from the object falls. It occurs in the binocular vision. The two images developed on the retina of both eyes are fused into a single sensation. So we see the objects with single image. This happens because of the ocular muscles which direct the axis of eye in such a way that the light rays from the object fall upon the corresponding points of both the retinas. And in case if the light rays do not fall on the corresponding retinal points, the person develops diplopia. Diplopia can be produced experimentally by applying the gentle pressure from outer side of one eye and thus displacing the eye from its normal position. Here you can pause this video and do this experiment and check by yourself. Okay, so let's proceed. Now the next important concept to understand is that the light rays from temporal part of visual field of an eye falls on the nasal half of retina of that eye, and those from the nasal part of visual field fall on the temporal half of retina of the same side. Similarly, the information from lower half of visual field will project on the upper part of retina and vice versa. If you all remember, we have already discussed in previous video that the image which falls on the retina is inverted and reversed with respect to the original object. Another important concept is that the information from right side of the visual field will be transmitted to the left visual cortex, and that from left side of the visual field will go to the right visual cortex. It is important to understand that the vision is a crossed sensation. This is because the fibers from temporal hemiretinae moves ipsilaterally uncrossed, whereas those coming from nasal hemiretinae will cross in optic chiasma and move contralaterally. So right visual cortex will receive fibers from right hemiretinae, which indeed receives information from left visual field and vice versa. Now let's come to visual pathway. So visual pathway or optic pathway is the nervous pathway that transmits impulses from retina to the cerebral cortex. It comprises of 6 components. They are optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, lateral geniculate body, optic radiation, and visual cortex. The primary visual pathway is also known as geniculo-striate pathway because it passes through the lateral geniculate nucleus on its way to primary visual cortex, which is also known as striate cortex because of myelin-rich stripes that run through its middle layers. Here I have used the term primary visual pathway because there are certain other pathways which start from retina and ends in areas other than primary visual cortex. And these secondary pathways, they serve various purposes other than the vision. For example, a second pathway from the retina runs to the superior colliculus, and it is important in controlling rapid eye movements. This pathway continues to the pontine formation in the brainstem and then to the extraocular motor nuclei. A third pathway extends from retina to the pretectal area of the midbrain, where neurons mediate the pupillary reflexes that control the amount of light which is entering the eyes, and also controls reflex movements of the eyes to focus on objects of more importance. One more pathway, it runs from retina to suprachiasmatic nucleus that controls circadian rhythms that synchronize various physiological changes of the body with night and the day, and also controls sleep-wake cycle. Another pathway extends into the ventral lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus and surrounding basal region of the brain, presumably to control some of the body's behavioral functions. These secondary pathways I will discuss in detail at some other time in my upcoming videos. But our today's topic is primary visual pathway or geniculo-striate pathway. So now let's discuss about it in more detail. So let's begin with optic nerve. It is the second cranial nerve and it is a part of central nervous system, and it is not a peripheral nerve. I am clearing this as most typically the optic nerve is grouped with the other 11 cranial nerves and is considered to be a part of peripheral nervous system. I repeat again that the optic nerve is technically a part of central nervous system rather than the peripheral nervous system. It is an extension of diencephalon and it is covered by myelin, which is produced by oligodendrocytes rather than Schwann cells which create myelin for peripheral nerves. Optic nerve is covered by all the 3 meningeal layers, that is dura mater, arachnoid mater and pia mater. and it is not affected by diseases which affect peripheral nerves. For example, Guillain-Barré syndrome. Some people pronounce it Guillain-Barré syndrome. Anyway, whether you pronounce it Guillain-Barré syndrome or Guillain-Barré syndrome, one thing is sure that it is not going to affect the optic nerve. Okay, so next point is that optic nerve is affected by diseases of central nervous system. For example, multiple sclerosis. And finally, the most important point is that optic nerve does not regenerate, as it is a part of central nervous system, whereas the peripheral nerves have the capacity to regenerate. Lastly, the optic nerve is a part of spatial somatic afferent system. So primary visual pathway starts from rod and cone cells, whose fibers synapse with dendrites of bipolar cells. These bipolar cells, they act as first order neurons in visual pathway. Then the axons of bipolar cells in turn synapse with dendrites of retinal ganglionic cells, which act as second order neurons in the visual pathway. Then the axons of retinal ganglion cells, they form optic nerve. The point at which the optic nerve leaves the eye is called optic disc and is the physiological blind spot. The fibers from temporal part of retina are in lateral part of the nerve and carry the impulses from nasal half of visual field of same eye. And the fibers from nasal part of the retina are in the medial part of nerve and carries the impulses from temporal half of visual field of same eye. Then later in their path at a point called optic chiasma, the medial fibers of each optic nerve, or we can say the fibers coming from nasal hemiretinae, they cross the midline and join the uncrossed lateral fibers, or we can say fibers coming from temporal hemiretinae of the opposite side to form optic tract. In simple words, we can say that the optic tract is formed by uncrossed fibers of optic nerve on the same side and crossed fibers of optic nerve from the opposite side. For example, left optic tract carries impulses from temporal part of left retina and nasal part of right retina. That is, it is responsible for vision in nasal half of left visual field and temporal half of right visual field. Now, if you look at the image here, you can see that at the point of decussation or crossing, the fibers coming from inferior part of nasal hemiretinae, or we can say the inferior nasal fibers, they decussate within the chiasma more anteriorly than the superior ones. As the inferior nasal retinal fibers approach the posterior aspect of the chiasma, the fibers shift to occupy the lateral aspect of the contralateral optic tract. So remember, the fibers from inferior part of nasal hemiretinae are in the medial part of optic nerve, whereas after decussation, these fibers are in lateral part of optic tract. I am stressing this point because you need to understand this concept in order to understand the visual field defect, which we will discuss later on in upcoming videos. Now, majority of fibers of optic tract, they terminate in lateral geniculate body or dorsal lateral geniculate nucleus of thalamus, which forms subcortical center for visual sensations. Approximately 10% of fibers, they divert before reaching the lateral geniculate body and they terminate in midbrain. This connection between optic tract and midbrain is called superior brachium. Here let me clear one thing. Please don't confuse this with inferior brachium, which carries auditory afferents. I repeat, inferior brachium carries auditory afferents and is a part of auditory system. And it is formed by bundles of fibers connecting inferior colliculus with medial geniculate body. We will discuss about inferior brachium in detail when I make the videos on vestibulocochlear system. So now let's come back to the topic. The axons of retinal ganglion cells, they project a detailed spatial representation of the retina on the lateral geniculate body. Now look at the image below on the right side. Each lateral geniculate body contains 6 well-defined layers. The layer 3 to 6 have small cells and are called parvocellular, whereas the layers 1 and 2 have large cells and are called magnocellular. On each side, layer 1, 4 and 6, they receive input from the contralateral eye, whereas layers 2, 3 and 5, they receive input from the ipsilateral eye. In each layer, there is a precise point-for-point representation of the retina, and all 6 layers are in the register, so that along a perpendicular line to the layers, the receptive fields of the cells in each layer are almost identical. It is worth noting that only 10 to 20% of input to the lateral geniculate body comes from the retina, whereas major inputs come from the visual cortex and other brain regions. The feedback pathway from the visual cortex has been shown to be involved in visual processing, which is related to the perception of orientation and motion. Now, another important concept here to understand is that there are several types of retinal ganglion cells. These include large ganglion cells, also called magno or M cells. These cells add responses from different kinds of cones and are concerned with movement and stereopsis. Another type is the small ganglion cells, also called as parvo or P cells. These cells subtract input of one type of cone from input of another type, and they are concerned with color, texture and shape. The M ganglion cells, they project to the magnocellular portion of the lateral geniculate body, whereas the P ganglion cells, they project to the parvocellular portion. Remember, till now we are discussing about the second order neurons which are coming directly from retina to the lateral geniculate body without any synapse in between. Then from the lateral geniculate body, a magnocellular pathway and a parvocellular pathway project to the primary visual cortex in the calcarine fissure area of the medial occipital lobe in the form of optic radiations or geniculocalcarine tract. The fibers in these radiations, they are called geniculocalcarine fibers. These are third order neurons in the visual pathway. These afferent fibers form a complete neural map on the contralateral visual field in the primary visual cortex. Here, the magnocellular pathway from layers 1 and 2 of lateral geniculate body carries signal for detection of movement, depth and flicker, whereas the parvocellular pathway, which is coming from layers 3 to 6 of lateral geniculate body, carries signals for color vision, texture, shape and fine detail. Now let's add few more points about optic radiation or geniculocalcarine tract. The fibers from lateral geniculate body, when they are projected to visual cortex in the form of optic radiation, they are projected in two groups. The upper fibers of optic radiations, which are called as parietal group, are taking information from upper half of retina and they are projected to superior bank of calcarine fissure. Whereas the lower fibers of optic radiations, which are called as temporal group, they are taking information from lower half of retina and are projected to inferior bank of calcarine fissure. The lower group of optic radiation, they loop around the temporal horn of lateral ventricles, thereby forming Mayer's loop. The primary visual cortex, it constitutes the first level of cortical processing of visual information. From there, the information is transmitted over two major pathways, a ventral pathway into the temporal lobe, which carries information about what the stimulus is, and a dorsal pathway into the parietal lobe, which carries information about where the stimulus is. This information is critical for guiding the movements. I will discuss about these two pathways in detail some other time in my upcoming videos on organization of visual cortex and visual association areas. So that's all for today. In my next video, I will discuss about visual field defects. So keep watching. Thank you. Have a nice day.